What happens when the ground you rely on to, get the job done literally melts beneath your feet?
Yeah.
That's the kind of challenge that forestry professionals are facing more and more these days.
Hmm.
And it's why we're doing this deep dive on the FBS podcast into forestry best management practices, or BMPs.
Right.
Those are the guidelines that help keep our forests healthy and productive.
Yeah.
But, what happens when extreme weather really throws a wrench into things?
Exactly.
That's what we're going to explore today.
Yeah.
Part of the Forest Business School's mission is to help mid-career professionals like you navigate a changing industry.
That's right.
So if you want to follow along and really get into the weeds with this, you can grab a copy of the New Hampshire Best Management Practices for Erosion Control.
Good idea.
It's at www.nhwoods.org.
It's fascinating how something as fundamental as frozen ground can really make or break a forestry operation. We kind of take it for granted, but things are changing.
Yeah, they really are.
Yeah.
Research shows that we're seeing a really significant decrease in the length of frozen ground conditions compared to, just a few decades ago.
It's true.
A study in New Hampshire found that the frozen ground season has shrunk by 2 to 3 weeks between 1948 and 2012.
Wow.
Think about that.
Yeah.
2 to 3 weeks, less time for traditional winter logging.
That's a big deal.
That's huge.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the timing either.
Right.
The unpredictability of winter weather is also increasing.
Absolutely.
We're seeing more freeze-thaw cycles, rain on frozen ground, and sudden thaws that can turn a seemingly stable logging road into a muddy mess.
Yeah. You never know what you're going to get out there anymore.
You really don't.
Yeah.
I remember seeing a video from a forestry specialist at UNH Extension.
Oh, yeah.
That showed exactly that. Rain falling on frozen ground, turning a logging road into this torrent of mud and sediment flowing right into a nearby stream.
It was shocking.
It was a stark reminder of what we're dealing with here,
It really is. It highlights why we need to kind of shift our mindset from just following BMPs to really understanding how we adapt them to these changing conditions.
Right.
And one way to do that is by thinking about safe wood versus risky wood.
Okay, I've heard those terms before.
Yeah.
But honestly, I'm not entirely clear on the distinction.
Sure.
What exactly do we mean by safe wood and risky wood?
So think of it this way. Safe wood is the area you can harvest pretty much any time of year.
Okay.
Without worrying too much about the weather,
Yeah.
The ground's well drained, slopes are gentle, and even if things thaw out a bit, you're unlikely to cause major problems.
Right.
Risky wood, on the other hand, that's the area that really needs those frozen conditions to be harvested safely and sustainably.
Yeah.
So this might be, a steep slope near a stream or a wetland, or a site with soils that are prone to compaction, things like that.
So it sounds like the idea is to prioritize harvesting that risky wood when the ground is solidly frozen.
Exactly. When you have that window of opportunity, go for those areas that are most vulnerable to damage if the weather turns bad.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
It's almost like a strategic game of forestry chess, right?
That's a good way to put it.
Figuring out which moves to make when the conditions are right.
Exactly.
But how realistic is that in practice?
Sure.
I mean, do loggers really have the flexibility to pick and choose which areas to harvest just based on weather conditions?
Well, it's a good question, and it's not always easy.
Yeah.
Loggers have contracts to fulfill, deadlines to meet, and economic realities to consider.
Right.
But I think the key is communication.
Okay.
Open and honest conversations between loggers, landowners, and foresters are crucial. Everyone needs to understand the risks involved and work together to find solutions that make sense for both the environment and the bottom line.
So it's not just about the logger making a decision in isolation.
No.
It's about everyone being on the same page.
Exactly. And sometimes that might mean adjusting the scope of a harvest, delaying operations until conditions improve, or even, finding ways to share the costs of implementing more robust BMPs in those challenging areas.
Right. And that brings up a good point. We've been talking about this shift in mindset, this need to adapt to extreme weather. But what does that actually look like on the ground?
Yeah.
What are some of the specific techniques that loggers can use to weatherproof their operations?
Well, it all starts with planning.
Okay.
And I mean, really getting to know the site,
Yeah.
not just, looking at a map or walking it on a sunny day.
So boots on the ground, getting a feel for the lay of the land.
Exactly. You want to walk the site during a heavy rain to see where water flows,
Oh, interesting.
where it pools, where it runs off,
Okay.
and ask yourself, what's going to happen if this thaws out before it actually does? Because once that ground starts to soften, you're already behind the 8 ball.
That's a great point. You need to anticipate the problems before they arise.
Absolutely. And once you have a good understanding of the site's hydrology and the potential weak points, you can start thinking about specific BMPs to implement.
So we're talking about those tried and true techniques that are already outlined in the BMP manuals, but with a twist.
Yeah, in a way, yes. The basic principles remain the same, but we need to be more strategic and adaptable in how we apply them.
Right.
So, for example, instead of just scattering slash piles randomly,
Yeah.
think about strategically stockpiling them every 500 feet along skid trails.
Okay.
That way, if you get a sudden thaw, you have material readily available to build water bars or reinforce soft spots.
That's a great idea.
Yeah.
That's like having a first aid kit for your logging site, ready to go when you need it.
Exactly. And the same goes for other materials. Have extra corduroy, timber mats, or even those absorbent wattles or socks on hand.
Oh, okay.
For quick deployment, being prepared can make all the difference when the weather throws a curveball.
All right, so stashing supplies strategically is one practical tip. What else can we do to weatherproof our operations?
Well, log barriers are another great option.
Okay.
They mimic natural forest features like fallen trees.
Right.
And they're incredibly effective at slowing down water and preventing erosion.
I've seen those used in stream restoration projects too. It's amazing how much of a difference a few well-placed logs can make.
It really is. And for high traffic areas like skid trails and landings, we can use techniques like heavy corduroy or timber mats to armor the site
Yeah.
and prevent equipment from damaging the soil.
I remember seeing a presentation by a forestry specialist from UNH Extension.
Oh, yeah.
And he shared a case study of a logging operation up in Errol, New Hampshire, that used extensive corduroy and timber mats to complete a job despite some truly terrible winter conditions.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of how these techniques can really make or break a project. They essentially built a temporary road system that allowed them to operate safely and efficiently,
Right.
even when the ground was a mess. But, using corduroy and timber mats brings up an important question about cost.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
These materials can be expensive,
they can.
and that's a real concern for loggers, especially, those working on smaller jobs or with tighter margins.
Yeah.
Is it always worth the investment?
It's a balancing act for sure. You have to weigh the cost of the materials against the potential cost of damage, delays, and environmental impacts.
Right.
And sometimes investing in those more robust solutions up front can save you a lot of headaches and money in the long run.
I see your point. It's about taking that long-term perspective.
Exactly. And that's where those conversations between the logger, the landowner, and the forester are so important.
Right.
They need to work together to decide what level of investment is appropriate for the site and the situation.
Yeah.
Sometimes it might mean, adjusting the scope of the harvest, delaying operations until conditions improve, or finding, creative ways to share the cost of those more expensive BMPs.
So it's not just about knowing the techniques. It's about understanding the context and making those informed decisions.
Exactly. And that brings us to another important aspect of weatherproofing forestry operations,
Right.
which is knowing what to do when a storm is on the horizon.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. One of the things that really stood out to me in the UNH Extension presentation was this idea of using hitches and ditches.
Hitches and ditches.
Yeah.
That sounds intriguing. What's that all about?
So imagine you have a ditch
Okay.
running alongside a skid trail or a road. It's meant to, carry water away.
Right.
But during a heavy rain, sediment can get washed into that ditch
Yep.
and end up polluting a stream.
I can definitely see how that would be a problem.
Yeah, it is. And the traditional solution might be a silt fence,
Right.
but sometimes that's just not enough,
Yeah.
especially in extreme weather.
Right.
So what some loggers have figured out is that they can actually line that ditch with whole trees.
Oh, wow.
Literally laying them end to end, tops touching tops, butts touching butts.
So you're creating a natural filter within the ditch itself.
Exactly. The trees slow down the water, allowing the sediment to settle out before it reaches the stream.
Oh, okay.
And here's the best part. At the end of the harvest, they can remove those trees, process them, and sell them.
Oh, wow.
So it's a win-win for the environment and the logger's bottom line.
That's a great example of how a little ingenuity can go a long way.
It is.
You're essentially using what's already on site to solve a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And you're even able to, get some value out of it later on.
Exactly. And it highlights something important. A lot of these extreme weather BMPs are about using what's already available in creative ways.
It's about working with nature, not against it.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the importance of planning and observation.
Mm-hmm.
A logger who understands the site, who knows where the water flows and how the ground responds to different conditions, can make smart decisions about how to use those natural resources to their advantage.
It's almost like reading the forest like a book.
Yeah.
Understanding its language,
Mm-hmm.
and then using that knowledge to guide your actions.
I love that analogy. And just like a good book, the forest has a lot to teach us if we're willing to listen.
That's true.
Another thing that stood out to me in the NESAF presentation was the discussion of armoring the site.
Armoring?
Yeah.
That sounds pretty heavy duty.
It can be.
Right.
Essentially, it's about creating a protective layer over vulnerable areas to prevent rutting and compaction.
Okay, so think skid trails, landings.
Yeah.
Places where heavy equipment is going to be moving back and forth.
Exactly. Traditional corduroy is a common technique.
Right.
But in extreme weather, you might need to go even further.
Okay.
We're talking heavy timbers, large diameter logs, or even prefabricated timber mats.
And those ends can be pretty expensive, right?
They can be.
Is it always realistic to expect loggers to use those kinds of materials, especially, on smaller jobs?
Well, but again, it's a matter of weighing the costs and benefits.
Right.
What's the cost of damaging the soil, creating erosion, and potentially polluting a stream?
Mm-hmm.
What's the cost of downtime if your equipment gets stuck in the mud?
Yeah.
Sometimes investing in those more expensive solutions up front can save you a lot of headaches and money in the long run.
It's a good point. It's about looking at the big picture,
Right.
and making decisions that are sustainable,
Mm-hmm.
both environmentally and economically.
Right. And the presenter from UNH Extension made a great point about how these decisions often come down to communication and collaboration.
Between the logger, the landowner, and the forester.
Exactly. Everyone needs to be on the same page about, the goals, the challenges, and the potential solutions.
Yeah.
And sometimes that means having some tough conversations about, costs and expectations.
It strikes me that these extreme weather challenges are really forcing the industry to become more sophisticated in a lot of ways.
It's true.
It's not just about knowing how to, run a chainsaw or operate a skidder anymore.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
Yeah.
We're not just talking about brute force logging anymore. It's
Right.
about observation, planning, adapting to changing conditions, and working collaboratively to find solutions that are, good for the forest, good for the business, and good for the environment.
It's about recognizing that the old ways of doing things might not always cut it, so to speak,
Right.
in this new era of unpredictable weather. We need to be willing to, innovate, experiment, and share what we learn with each other.
You hit the nail on the head. It's a challenging time, but it's also an exciting time to be in forestry.
Mhm.
We're on the front lines of figuring out how to work sustainably in a changing world.
Right.
And I think there's a lot of room for creativity and innovation.
Speaking of creativity, let's talk about some of those temporary closeout techniques.
Sure.
You mentioned wattles and socks earlier. I have to admit, I'm still a little fuzzy on what those are and how they work.
So these are pretty cool, actually.
Okay.
Imagine a long tube, kind of like a giant sausage casing,
Okay.
filled with either straw or compost.
Okay.
These wattles, or socks, are placed across a road or a skid trail, usually at a slight angle,
Mm-hmm.
and they act like a speed bump for water runoff.
So they slow the water down, allowing sediment to settle out.
Exactly. And because they're relatively lightweight and flexible,
Yeah.
they can be deployed quickly, even in tight spaces.
Right.
It's a great way to protect a stream crossing or a sensitive area if a storm is coming,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't have time for a more permanent solution.
And then once the threat has passed, you can remove them and reuse them elsewhere.
Precisely. They're a great tool to have in your arsenal. And in some cases, you can even use silt fence for temporary closeout.
Oh, okay.
It's not ideal,
Right.
but it can be a quick and dirty solution in a pinch.
All of these techniques are really pointing to the importance of having a plan B or even a plan C
Mm.
when it comes to forestry operations these days.
Yeah.
You can't just assume that everything is going to go according to plan.
I couldn't agree more. The days of just assuming that the things will go according to plan are over.
Right.
We need to be flexible, resourceful, and prepared to adjust our approach as conditions change.
And that flexibility extends to the timing of operations too, right?
Absolutely.
We can't always stick to a rigid schedule anymore.
That's one of the biggest challenges for loggers and foresters.
Yeah.
We might need to work nights or early mornings when the ground is frozen. Or we might need to shut down operations entirely during a thaw.
Right.
Even if it means missing deadlines.
Yeah, it's all about finding that balance between getting the job done
Right.
and protecting the resource.
Exactly. And sometimes that means making tough decisions.
Right.
But ultimately, it's about doing what's right for the long-term health of the forest
Yeah.
and the sustainability of the industry.
Well said. Going back to that case study in Errol, New Hampshire, it's amazing how the loggers in that situation had to essentially create two separate stream crossings.
Yeah.
One for summerfall and one for winter
Wow.
because of the changes in ground conditions and the safety concerns.
It was an impressive feat of engineering,
Yeah.
and it really highlights how much planning and forethought goes into these operations these days.
Yeah.
They had to use a combination of prefabricated bridge panels, culverts, and even logs to create a stable crossing that wouldn't damage the stream.
It sounds like they really had to think outside the box.
They did. And I think that's a valuable lesson for all of us in forestry. We need to be willing to challenge the status quo, experiment with new ideas,
Right.
and find creative solutions to the challenges we face.
Yeah.
And that's something we're going to continue to explore as we dive deeper into this topic of extreme weather BMPs.
You keep mentioning the importance of, communication and collaboration. And I think that's a really key point here. It's not just about one person,
Right.
the logger, the landowner, or the forester having all the answers.
Yeah.
It's about working together to find solutions that work for everybody.
Absolutely. These extreme weather events are really highlighting how interconnected everything is in the forest ecosystem. What happens on one part of the landscape can have ripple effects elsewhere.
That's a good way to put it.
Right.
It's like a chain reaction.
It is.
And it really underscores why it's so important for everyone involved in forestry operations to be on the same page.
Exactly. And that communication needs to start early on,
Okay.
in the planning process, before any trees are cut or any equipment, rolls onto the site.
So you're saying that the initial site assessment is even more crucial now than it used to be?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
It's not enough to just look at the topography and the soil types. You need to think about the potential impacts of extreme weather events.
Really?
Where's the water going to go if we get a heavy rain or a sudden thaw?
Yeah.
Are there any sensitive areas that we need to be particularly careful around?
You need to kind of have that extreme weather lens on.
Yes.
From the very beginning.
Exactly. And that's where the forester's expertise is so valuable. They can help the landowner and the logger understand the risks and develop a plan that minimizes those risks.
But it's not just about, the forester coming in and dictating what needs to be done, right?
No.
It's a two-way street.
It's a two-way street. Absolutely. The logger brings their on-the-ground experience and knowledge of the equipment and the operational constraints.
Oh.
The landowner brings their understanding of the property
Right.
and their long-term goals for the forest.
It sounds like a real team effort.
It is. And when everyone's working together, communicating openly and sharing their expertise, that's when you get the best results.
So what's the key to making that collaboration happen effectively?
Yeah.
Is there a secret formula or?
I don't know if there's a secret formula, but I think it starts with respect,
Okay.
Respect for the land, respect for each other's expertise, and a willingness to listen and learn from each other.
It makes sense. It's about building that trust and understanding.
Right. And it's also about being upfront about the challenges.
Yeah.
These extreme weather events they're putting a lot of pressure on the forestry industry. We're seeing increased costs, more downtime,
Right.
more uncertainty.
Yeah.
And we need to be honest about those challenges if we're going to find solutions.
It's not about pretending that everything's fine.
Right.
You got to face the reality of the situation.
Exactly. And that includes talking about money.
Right.
These extreme weather BMPs, they often come with a price tag.
Yeah.
And everyone needs to understand that.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it might mean adjusting the scope of the harvest or finding creative ways to share the costs.
It strikes me that these conversations about extreme weather BMPs are really forcing the forestry industry to evolve.
I think that's true.
It's not just about business as usual anymore.
No.
It's about adapting.
Yeah.
Innovating.
Mm-hmm.
Finding new ways to work sustainably in a changing world.
I think that's a really positive development. We're seeing a lot of creativity and ingenuity out there.
Yeah.
Loggers are experimenting with new techniques,
right?
Sharing their knowledge with each other. Mm-hmm. Foresters are developing new tools and resources to help landowners make informed decisions. Yeah. And everyone is starting to recognize that we're all in this together.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
We're all part of the same ecosystem. Mm-hmm. We all depend on healthy forests, mm-hmm. and we all have a role to play in protecting them.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of forestry BMPs in the face of extreme weather.
Yeah.
What's the one message you would like to leave our listeners with?
Well, after all we've discussed, I think the takeaway for me is this,
Yeah.
The challenges we're facing are real.
Right. But so are the solutions.
Yeah.
We have the knowledge,
yeah.
the tools, and the ingenuity to adapt to these changing conditions.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of putting them into practice.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
And I want to add that this is an ongoing conversation. The more we learn, the more we share, and the more we collaborate, the better equipped we'll be to navigate these challenges and ensure the health of our forests for generations to come.
That's a great note to end on.
And don't forget, folks, if you want to dive deeper into this topic, you can grab a copy of the New Hampshire Best Management Practices for Erosion Control at www.anytwoods.org.
Good idea.
It's a fantastic resource that goes into even more detail about the techniques we've talked about today.
Absolutely. And if you're a mid-career professional looking to level up your skills and knowledge in this evolving field, be sure to check out the Forest Business School. There you go.
We offer a range of programs designed to help you stay ahead of the curve and thrive in this changing industry.
Excellent. Well, thanks for joining us on this episode of the FBS Podcast.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time for another deep dive.
Hey, this is Steve Bick with the Forest Business School. Thanks for listening to the FBS Podcast, and I hope you will subscribe. The truth is, these deep dives barely scratch the surface of some of the topics we cover in the Forest Business School programs, and the podcast is a way of reaching a wider audience. Check out my website at vtfbs.com for more information. Reach out if you want to talk about one of the FBS programs or have custom training or project needs that you'd like to discuss. Again, thanks for listening to the FBS Podcast.